We are now inviting our first keynote speaker to this conference, and I'm happy to introduce him to you. This is Pierangelo Isernia, professor of the University of Siena, who will present us the research about the impact of COVID-19 on cultural and creative industries and international cultural relations. This research was conducted under the Cultural Relations Platform program, and Sana will help us as a co-speaker of Pierangelo. I will be here as well, helping with your questions, so please put your questions in the Q&A section. We will be checking them and introducing to Pierangelo and Sana in the end of their presentation. So let's begin. Pierangelo, Sana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I don't know, Sana, if you want to go first, or I can start my presentation right away. Your microphone, Sana.
For noticing that. No, I want just to say a couple of words before you start to frame the study within the platform. As I said, when we started the platform, when we launched it 1 year ago, we were really in April 2020, we were in the midst of the start of the pandemic. We were, I think, in Brussels and in many other countries in a full lockdown, and we were starting this platform. And the first thing that came to our mind, because we noticed a huge impact in coming in for our work within the platform, but also for the field of international cultural relations in general. Then we thought, let's start with launching this study to look at the impact of the COVID on international cultural relations, because it's very much linked to the future work of the platform. It's very much linked to our partner organizations' future, to our interlocutors in Europe and also in third countries. And we started the study, to carry out the study with the University of Siena, with Pierangelo and his colleague Alessandro La Monica. And also we have hired regional experts from the Western Balkans, from Ukraine, from other countries, from the Eastern Partnership, from North Africa, Middle East, and also Latin America, in line with the geographical focus, actually, of the study. That's just, I wanted to give you some bit of background, and I'm very happy that Pierangelo will go through more details and give you more information about the main findings and outcomes of the study. I understand that you have around 35 minutes, Pierangelo, for the presentation, and then that we will open the floor for questions and answers.
Definitely so. Let me first try to share the screen, if I can replicate what I tried to do a few minutes ago.
Yeah, we see it.
You can see it now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Let me first of all thank the Ukrainian Institute for inviting me to this conference. I'm very sorry I cannot be there in person. I've never been to Ukraine, but I'm looking forward to be there in the near future as the vaccination program goes on, and hopefully we go back to some sort of normal that might be different from the one we were used to, but still not the present situation. As Sana said, as part of the activities of the Cultural Relations Platform, in the spring of 2020, we started a research project on the impact of COVID-19 on the cultural and creative sectors, and more in general, international cultural relations, almost worldwide. We covered several countries, partners, and strategic actors that are of interest for the European Union. As any other sector in society, also culture has been heavily hit by the pandemic. Available data confirm without any doubt that cultural organizations have been suffering both as organization and as individual members of the consequences of the pandemic. In our research, we looked at both the impact and the policy responses that were given by mostly public actors, but not only. We also try to look at the non-state actors intervention. As a consequence, my presentation will go on in basically 3 steps. Before introducing shortly the presentation, what I have to say is that in order to assess the impact of anything on anything else, we need to understand a bit the nature of what has been impacted. And the cultural sector is a sector of society and of the economy that has a very peculiar nature that we should take into account in trying to understand what the COVID brought about. So I will devote a few words about describing what are the characteristics of the cultural sector that make it at the same time very fragile and less resilient than others in facing the consequences of events like the one we have been going through in the last 2 years. Then I will briefly look at the impact of this pandemic on the cultural sectors in both Europe and elsewhere, and last, on the policy responses that were given by governments and public authorities to try to address some of the problems and the fragility of the cultural sector. And I will end up with some final considerations. Let me say, first of all, a few caveats, however, about our study and its methodology. What we did is what we call in the scientific jargon, a secondary analysis of data. Our research was conducted in a time scope of a few months in order to address an urgent need for understanding what was happening in the cultural sector due to the pandemic. So what we did was an inventorying and mapping of what had been done and produced in order to understand the impact of COVID-19 on the cultural sector. And to do so, we looked at the available online and offline data. And as Sana already mentioned, we also heavily relied upon the expertise and the knowledge of a group of experts in the different regions that were of competence for our research project. Now, of course, the cultural sector is a very diverse sector of society and of the economy. So you will forgive me if I'm going to give you a tour d'horizon rather than an in-depth analysis of specific cases. I understand from your program that there will be opportunity for zeroing in on some specific cases of crisis or impact of COVID-19. So what I would do is to look at the overall picture. Inevitably, this picture will be broad, so we'll try to take into account the diversity and the variety of situation, but will not be able to make justice of all the different situations. And on top of that, we have also to say that the pandemic has revealed at least one important weakness of the cultural sector, and this weakness has to do with the fact that this is a sector on which high quality, precise data on the economic, social, and political effects of an event on the sector itself are extremely hard to get. It's a sector in which, contrary-wise to others, we do not have enough data, and data sometimes, and in this case as well, are very important to decide what to do to address the problems that are there. So our study was, as a consequence of all this, exploratory, qualitative, and descriptive. We are in the process of thinking to go ahead with other more in-depth and to a certain sense more focused research, but this is something for the future. Now, let me start, as I said, with describing some characteristics of the cultural sectors worldwide that make it at the same time extremely vulnerable and less resilient than others to the impact of events like the pandemic. Why this is so? Well, culture is a relevant economic sector for societies in many different areas of the world. This is true in Europe, but also is a reality elsewhere, is vibrant and active both on the supply and the demand side in terms of number of organizations, interest of the people, for cultural products. But it's also a fragile sector of society for a few reasons that I will try to spell out, but has been already detailed in other studies. First, on the demand side, we have a situation in which culture can live in two different worlds. On the one hand, it can be highly concentrated, so the demand of cultural products come from very few sources, or on the other hand, like it is as an example in the sector of music or performing arts or museums, can be also highly dispersed, depending the demand on a lot of people that, by the way, is affected by issues of social distancing and impediment to movement. It's also true that culture as such occupies only a marginal role in governmental activities. If we take governmental expenditures as an indicator of how much attention governments pay to culture, culture is by far among the least important sector of society. And this, in a situation like the one we have been going through in the last 2 years, makes a lot of difference in the ability of the governments to address the problems of the area. There are also problems on the supply side. It's a form of economic sector characterized by unstandardized forms of working. Most or a lot of the workers work in part-time or temporary conditions in economic organizations that are parcelized, small or medium-sized firms that are, to a certain extent, relying upon the voluntary or part-time work of several people that have no regular or full-time contracts. So the cultural and creative sector is, to a certain extent, one of the more exposed and sensitive areas of the economy and of the society, exposed to uncertainty and to economic shocks. This structural vulnerability, of course, is complicated also by another condition that has to do with the fact that, given the form of the job market, it's extremely difficult for public and private authorities to understand who are those who are most in need and to address their need. So the pandemic, in a certain extent, has magnified what could be defined a perfect storm, a society in which the cultural sector, or societies in which the cultural sector is fragile, and a situation in which a lot has to rely upon the responses of public actors that sometimes have difficulty in understanding what and how to address these problems. However, an answer has been there, different in different countries, and this is what I'm going to explore in the next slides. But let me first say a few words about the impact of COVID-19. I mean, imagine that I'm talking here to an audience that knows many of these issues, that have experienced many of these issues firsthand. So I'm not going to develop to match the harshness of the situation, but simply to say that this impact has been deep, has been generalized, and has affected all dimensions of the cultural sector. First, it has had organizational implications. The organizations working in the cultural sector have been exposed to a lot of organizational stress due to the fact that in many, almost all countries, there's been temporary or permanent closure of all activities. A drop in the demand of cultural products with the consequences of reduction of staff, both temporary and permanent, and of course, the movement of people and services in the cultural sectors has come to a standstill. There are not only organizational implications, but also financial implications. There's been a reduction of income due both to a drop in the demand, but also due to the difficulties of accessing the banking system for financing the shortcuts coming from the social and economic consequences of the pandemic. This has also affected public bodies that have reoriented a lot of resources in other directions. So the combination of the difficulty of access to the financial system and the reduction in support for the public and the private sector, of course, has magnified the financial impact of the COVID-19. Also, the consumption habits of citizens have been changing, and this has affected the approach to culture. Audiovisual, movies, and music has been slightly or differently affected than performing arts or museums, in which, of course, or theaters, in which, of course, the social distancing measures have had a more dramatic impact. Whether, and this is something for the future, whether these changes in the consumption habits of citizens are going there to last, or we will be back to normal, is a big question, and the question is still open, and would be crucial to understand and to answer this question to see what the new normal could be. Last but not least, the impact has been asymmetric in nature across the different cultural subsectors. Some sectors of the cultural and creative industries have been hit more severely than others. As I already mentioned, music, and to a certain sense, the movie sector has been quicker in trying to react to the pandemic. Performing arts, visual arts have had a greater problem in addressing the challenges. So the impact has been huge, of a amplitude that probably we have never seen in the past. I'm offering you only a few examples of these consequences. As you can see from the statistics and the numbers, we are talking here of huge consequences in terms of both jobs, finance, and activities. I have also to say that, understandably, I mean, knowing the situation, the situation before the pandemic, the differences in the effects and in the devastation of the pandemic also depends on several pre-existing conditions. Europe and US has been less affected than other areas of the world, like Brazil, like Ukraine, like Morocco, some of the countries we examined. The impact has also changed, or also varied depending on the answers that the governments have given to this. And we will see in a few minutes that the responses of the governments have been different. All governments have tried to do something, but some governments have done better than others. This, of course, has affected also the international cultural relations. the impact of the impact of the pandemic on international cultural relations could be seen and discussed at different levels. There is a direct impact, and there is a less direct, more indirect, or if you want, long-term impact of the pandemic. From the more direct impact of the pandemic, we can say that the pandemic is affecting the amount of activities and the amount of resources that are given to the cultural sector and to cultural relations. But this is not something that was only created by the pandemic. The pandemic, to a certain extent, has been the accelerator of something that was started before the pandemic, and as I said, the pandemic contributed to make worse. And there is a combination of domestic factors and international factors that have affected the impact of the pandemic on international cultural relations. The more direct domestic conditions have to do with the fact that in a situation like the one we have been through, most of the activities that were devoted to cultural relations, especially in European countries, have been scaled down, or resources have been simply diverted to other purposes. This, of course, has reduced the ability of EU institutions and EU member states to collaborate and to cooperate in international cultural relations activities. And this has also created tensions within the European institutions among different goals or different demands. Clearly, the European recovery instruments that has been displayed by the commissions for addressing problems that are specific of the European Union have had a big impact on the funding available for other purposes and other directions, among which international cultural relations. On top of that, we need to remember that the pandemic has precipitated an economic recession in a set of countries that were already affected by a previous recession. In fact, if you want, by two previous recessions in the last decade and a half. But beside these domestic conditions that mostly have affected what we could say the rich countries in their ability to support international cultural relations, there are also international factors that the pandemic has contributed to magnify, to explode, but were there already before. And I'm referring here to what has been labeled the crisis of the international liberal order. As you might have heard, the appearance of illiberal and isolationist current, both in the East and in the West, in the North and in the South, has produced an increase in superpower rivalry, and also, I have to say, a geopolitical turn in the EU institutions themselves. So, to a certain extent, also the European Union and its member states are part of this wake that stress more the importance of our own domestic national sovereign perspective as compared to international cooperation. And this, of course, is very well exemplified by the vaccine diplomacy that we have been experiencing both in Europe and in the rest of the world in the last year. Beside this direct impact, there has been also an indirect impact of the COVID-19 on cultural relations. And this might possibly has to do with the more lasting effects in the sense that international cultural events, international movement of people and goods have been basically stopped. And this, of course, has contributed to a disruption of the international cultural climate that was there in the past years. And this has affected clearly more those countries that were benefiting from the support of the European Union and other states or group of states like that. So what to do? What has been done to address some of these challenges? If you want the good news, if you want to see this as a half empty as full glass, the responses have been there in almost all countries. No countries has simply done nothing to address the issues of the cultural sector and the problems the cultural sector was facing. But of course, this response has been very different. And I have also to remember here that what we are discussing in our research is the impact and the responses on the short term. Our research basically stopped after the summer of 2020. So it's looking at what has been done in the very first period of the pandemic. This, of course, raised the issue of what has been done and whether something has changed later on, but this is something for future studies. Now, as I said, most countries we have analyzed have seen responses coming from both the public sector, from cultural organizations themselves, and from private actors. Of course, these responses have varied hugely. Variation has been huge. If you want us to try to synthesize what has driven this variation, we have stressed three main factors that have affected how and with which complexities countries and international organizations have addressed the challenges of COVID-19 for the cultural sector. First, of course, the financial resources available to the countries. Richest countries had more slack to devote resources to address the issues of the cultural sector than poor countries. So financial resources have been a big preconditions to account for the different responses of countries. The second important factor has been how the relationship between the cultural sector and governments were shaped before the pandemic. To make this thing simple, and of course, being aware of the superficiality that this description implies, we can imagine two different models of how the relationship between public authorities and the cultural sector are shaped. One is market-oriented. The US, to a certain extent, is the best example of this kind of approach, but there are countries like Brazil in which this is also a reality. So situations in which the cultural sector is mostly dominated by the private sector and the public authorities have only a supportive or a regulatory role. On the other side, there are those countries in which the cultural sector is mostly supported by public authorities. And I'm thinking here of countries like France or Italy. Now, the responses to the crisis given by governments have been heavily affected by the nature of the relationship between the public and the cultural sector, the public authorities and the cultural sector, with, to a certain extent, a greater ability of those countries in which government-oriented or public authorities-oriented relationship were shaping the relationship with the cultural sector as compared to the market-oriented. Last but not least, the attitudes of the governments toward the pandemic itself. And here it comes the issue of populism and to what extent the way the governments were shaping the crisis have affected the responses. The more the countries were minimizing or overlooking, especially at the beginning, the impact of the pandemic, the less the responses has been effective and wide in scope. In order to explore the measures that were undertaken, we have collected a big data set of policy responses. We were able to find more than 700 different policy responses that 54 states, the one that were part of our mandate, have given. And so we can also have a glimpse of what kind of responses were given by public and private authorities to the COVID-19. You will not be surprised probably to see that these responses have been mostly economic in nature. You should not be surprised because, as I said, we are talking here of a period that was the beginning of the crisis. And so clearly, when you have a big crisis, the first thing you need to address are the most urgent one. And the economic measures were the overwhelming majority of measures that were provided by governments at different levels. And most of these have been, let's say, used in a way that reflect this urgency, because out of the 82.5% of measures out of these more than 700 policy responses that were given were focusing on economic responses. Most of them, a plurality of them, were represented by disbursement, by trying to give direct financial support to the sector. Almost half of all measures that are of economic nature have been in the form of disbursement of grants, loans, and cash transfers. Much less was done in terms of indirect economic support, like, as an example, exemptions, exonerations from fiscal deadlines, referrals of obligations, and things like that. Now, let me stress this that could be seen as a good news to a certain extent, and it is a good news. It's also problematic because, as I mentioned at the very beginning, disbursement of money was probably the measure most practiced by governments, not only for the cultural sectors, but for all sectors of society. The problem is that the cultural sector is a sector in which to find those who are the recipient of this money, of these cash transfers, are more difficult than in other sectors, like the automotive or the big industries, for the very nature of the sector itself. So even if direct measures have been there, their implications sometimes can be more problematic than in other sectors because we're more difficult to reach those who were in need. There has been also differences in the kind of measures that has been addressed to the different subsectors. As you can see here, of course, most of the measures, this has to be remembered, most of the measures were multi-purpose. So when a policy response was given, usually the government was trying to eat or to kill several birds with one stone. So this is not a surprise in itself, but still, considering all the different measures and those who were the recipients of this measure, we can see there has been some differences in the number of, or let's say, in the amount of attention that different sectors have been receiving. So you can see, as an example, that the audiovisual sector has been receiving a big chunk of all the possible responses, most of them, as I said, economic, while other sectors have been receiving much less, and visual arts is one of these. Now, what explains these differences? Some of these differences are due to the nature of the cultural sector as an economic sector, as I already mentioned. Other priorities or other variations in priorities depends also on the nature of the relationship between governments and the cultural sectors and between the different orientation of the cultural sectors in the different societies. So it's difficult to generalize from this picture to a clear pattern. Most of our attention was devoted to the cultural sector, to the responses to the cultural sector of the governments, but the governments were not alone in this kind of response. Non-state actors have also played an important role. We can see this role in at least three ways. First, non-state actors have played a role in directly supporting the sector. This, as an example, has been typical of countries like the United States and to a certain extent also Brazil. To a certain extent, to compensate for the lack or deficient response of the public actors. A second role than non-state actors have been more a role of advocacy, meaning pushing the governments to address with specific measures the cultural sector. So the civil society has been very important in affecting the government policies. Last but not least, we have also to remember that the responses have been varying depending on the nature of the political regimes in which the responses were taking place. Why? Because there have been countries, typical federal countries, in which regional and local authorities have played a much greater role than central authorities in addressing the issue of the cultural sector. Again, Brazil comes to mind, but there might be other examples. However, as we put, the blanket was too short for such a cold night like the one that the pandemic created, and the resources were not enough, and these might have lasting implication for the future. We also have to stress that most of the resources were devoted to economic measures. We can imagine, we can see now a shifting toward more non-economic kind of measures, but this is something that should be discussed for the future, because if the pandemic is going to live with us to a certain extent also for the future, this might have lasting implication for the cultural sector. Last but not least, before I move to the final consideration, and I think my time is running out, Sana is not flagging me ominous signs.
I was about to do it.
Okay, so I simply preempted you.
You have a couple of minutes left, like
okay,
3 minutes.
So let's say that some of these measures have been not systematically conceived. Governments were taken to a certain extent out of surprise from the pandemic, not only in the economy, in the cultural sectors, in all sectors of society. So many responses has been very much ad hoc and temporary, and this probably has also affected the amount of effectiveness of this measure. Some final consideration. What the future will bring to us. Now, let me say that as I see it now, and this is my personal view, it's very hard to understand what's up to us, because the future, as is written here, is behind the horizon line. A lot will depend on how the pandemic will go. A lot will depend on how the countries will adapt themselves to live together with the pandemic in some forms also in the future. And a lot will also depend on the way the cultural sector will adapt itself to this more lasting situation. So I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but a question is still with us, whether in fact the cultural sector has still to pass its harder resilience test once the first stage of the pandemic is gone and we are going back to a new normal. To do so, to try to understand what is needed, let me conclude with this last slide on food for thought. We need more information. We have realized that in order to help and answer the need of the cultural sector, we need more information. Better information, high quality information. We need smarter interventions. Precision funding is a way to describe it, meaning that we need to address in a specific way the needs of the cultural sector, adapting the financial instruments to the nature of the sector. So adopting the needed flexibilities to reach wider audience, to easing administrative procedures, to restructuring eligibility criteria. We need also to look at the issue of solidarity and fairness in accessing the resources, because the pandemic has shown that different sectors of the cultural sector have access to available resources in different ways and with different degrees of difficulties. We need to make sure that all cultural subsectors are treated in a fair and equitable way, meeting their own specific needs. Now, all this requires research, of course, but also a lot of commitment by governments and international institutions. And the extent to which international institutions and governments will be able to do so is, to me, still an open question. And with this question, I stop my presentation and I leave the floor to Sana or to anybody else. Should I drop the sharing, I think? Okay.
Thank you, Pierangelo. Thank you. It was I listened to you with a great interest again, even if I have read this study I don't know how many times, but it was still a good reminder of the current situation we are in. So what about, Irina, that we take the questions from the chat first? And then and I think there is one question there, and then we go back.
Yes, we have one question from the chat from Nadia Sokolenko. She is asking, dear Mr. Pierangelo Isernia, can you please specify more about the countries with most effective policy response according to the research? What were the measures undertaken, if you have such data?
Should I go one by one, or?
I suppose Nadia is asking if you can mention one or two specific countries which you think.
No, okay. No, my question is: should I collect questions, or I answer one by one?
This is the only question at the moment, so you can.
Okay.
Do this.
Okay. Now we, as I mentioned sometime during the presentation, in our mandate, we focus our attention on a limited set of countries. These were mostly countries that were either strategic partners or were part of the neighborhood policy of the European Union. Although I have also to say that in collecting the policy responses, we basically looked at the entire world. So we, as an example, included also the European countries. This means that we have a first element of to consider that the variety of responses is very different between the European countries and the United States and Japan on the one hand, and the rest of the world on the other end. Most policy responses we were able to collect were coming from the first group rather than from the second. This, by the way, was also the reason why we relied upon the help of regional experts to fill the gap. Because, of course, relying on public sources, there is a problem of accountability, and some countries have more problems in showing what they are doing than others. Now, coming to the question, what are the most affected? As I already said, the most affected are coming from the south of the world rather than from the north. But within the south, there's been variation depending on the factors that I just mentioned. First, when the economic sector were dominated by a market-oriented philosophy, the countries had greater problems to channel helps to the cultural sector. An example is Brazil, where the central government was clearly ineffective in addressing the challenge, and from the public sector, all answers came mostly at the regional or state level. Another example, less dramatic, of course, given the nature of the country, was the United States, in which the federal state was much less active than the state level in addressing the issues. A second element that contributed to the gravity of the crisis was the attitudes of the governments. When the government was overlooking the crisis, you had problems. Again, Brazil, but we have also other cases like India and some countries in the Western Balkans that were less quick in understanding the scope of the crisis, were most severely hit. So a lot has to do with the cultural sector, but there was also some agency by political actors.
Pierangelo, can you maybe mention some countries where you felt through the research that they had the most effective, actually, policy responses? Because that's what Nadia wanted, I understand.
Okay, the one who was most effective. Let me give you this answer. The countries that were most effective were those countries in which there was a good interaction between public authorities and non-state actors in addressing the issue. I'll give you a couple of examples. One of these, if I remember correctly, was the case of Morocco, a country in which there was a systematic attempt by non-state actors to try to answer some of the challenges of the sector, given the limited resources that were available. Another example in which we have had a good collaboration that had brought some help is also in some countries in the Western Balkans, where the government were initially slow to react, but also thanks to the non-state actors, they were able to do more than was needed. I'm trying to remember now whether the case was Serbia or another. Yes, yeah. Yes, okay. I'm sorry, the countries are many. The report is very detailed, and my memory is what it is. By the way, the report is public, so I invite all of you to read it going to the webpage of the cultural.
Exactly, and we have put it in the chat. You can see also the report. It has been put in the chat by Yermina Stanoyev.
Yes, and there are a lot of details about the different countries, more than I can remember right now, I have to confess.
Thank you, Pierangelo. May I ask you, I want to ask you a question about the digital transformation. I think this is really very, very important topic. And I think the impact of the digital transformation on international cultural relations, even if it has still to be explored and studied, etc., I think this is something that should be tackled in the future. And I wanted to have your views on digitalization and how this can favor, increase cultural relations, or maybe hinders some cultural relations between countries and different stakeholders.
Okay, let me say that we address the issue of digitalization because it comes up from the results of the research. The main message to me, and then I will develop a bit further, is that the digitalization should not be seen necessarily as a blessing in disguise, because it has asymmetric impact on the cultural sector. And therefore, there is no one-size-fits-all kind of answer to what digitalization can do to the cultural sector. Let me elaborate a bit on this. First, there are substantial inequalities in digital access, both from the cultural practitioner's viewpoint and from the cultural consumer's viewpoint. These structural inequalities are not only due to the digital divide. So it's not only a problem that some regions or some areas or some sectors of society have greater access to digitalization than others, but has to do with the nature of the cultural sector itself. This asymmetric impact of digitalization means that we need a smart approach to digitalization. Again, it's not a panacea for all our problems. First, we should develop measures aimed at reducing barriers to access from the consumer viewpoint. Consumer side, especially in developing countries, need to find lower access barriers to the consumption of cultural goods. Second, we needed an investment in training and in helping the cultural sector and the cultural actors to adapt themselves to the production and distribution methods of digital goods. So it's not only a problem of consumers, but it's also a problem of producers. And last but not least, there is a need for financial resources, especially in the neighbor countries and some strategic countries like India or Brazil. We need financial resources to allow to overcome these starting point barriers to enter into the sector. But as I said, the nature of the digitalization impact is complex and differentiated and should not be treated as a solution to all our problems. By the way, being a university professor that for more than 1 year has taught online, I have to say that I am fed up. Sorry for this personal comment.
No, thank you for your honesty about this. It goes the same, I think, for some students. Anyway, so let's take another question. Yeah, there is one other question in the chat. I see that it's from Darina. By the way, Darina and Anna Kornok are our experts helping us in this activity. So Darina is asking, what could be the main contemporary topics and themes for the international cross-sectoral cultural projects today? And she's already giving some examples like ecology issues, capacity building, etc.
Okay, this is a big question that, by the way, we have been struggling with Sana and the team of the Cultural Relations Platform, because this is going to, this is something we should address ourselves. So it's very personal to an extent. Now, okay, I don't want to sound like to a professor, but first there is a problem of information. We need to know more about how the cultural sector has reacted to the crisis, and what kind of answers have been given at the local level, especially at the local level, to the crisis. So we need more information. But this is not all. In terms of topics, I would say that there are at least two, maybe three. One is, and this I would say is also a political. Would be a political astute movement, is to link the reflection about the future of the cultural sector to the issues of sustainability and the environment, for two reasons. One, because sustainability is a concept wide enough to be helpful also to understand what the future of the cultural sector could be beyond the horizon line. The more political reason is that, of course, there is a lot of attention, especially in the EU, on these topics. So to link it with showing that the cultural sector can contribute to this might be also helpful politically. A second issue that personally I think important is to better understand and if you want study how the combination of digitalization, mobility, and communication can be addressed by the different subsectors of the cultural sectors. As I said at the very end of my comments on the digitalization issue, we need training. We need training. We need training to help the cultural sectors to adapt themselves, but also to understand the limits. Last but not least, and again, this might be too academic, this is an opportunity to study the micro foundations of the cultural sector. What I want to say is the following. The cultural relations are under attack. As simple as that. For several political, ideological reasons, you name it. The cultural sector has a value in itself, and nobody doubts about that, but it has also a political value in fostering trust, mutual understanding, cooperation, reducing tension, putting people in others' cultural shoes, help countries a lot to address many of the challenges we have. Now, how to do this better and to what extent the cultural sector can change attitudes of people, being them stakeholders, simply consumers, on others, is very important, because in time of crisis, we need to show that we are, among brackets, useful not only because culture is enjoyable and enrich our own personal life, but also because culture can contribute to a political environment that is more conducive to a peaceful, cooperative behaviors. I stop here because I am already mentioning a mountain, so I don't want to go even further up.
There is one more question in our stage Q&A chat. So if I may, I will read it. It's from Anna Bubnova. Good morning. Could you please name the main 3 consequences of the pandemic on creative sector for the countries with more effective measures and less effective measures? So 3 main consequences for the sector.
Sorry, for which? For the most and for the least?
Yes, for the most effective and for the least effective.
Well, I mean, you want me to write a paper. Okay, what are the 3 main consequences of the pandemic for the cultural sector? Let me remember the caveat I had at the beginning. The cultural sector is a very diverse sector. There are many different things in it. Visual, films, musics, performing arts. So it's difficult to find an effort that cuts across all the different sectors. But said that, what I would personally say are the 3 most important. Well, the first is simply that is economic. The cultural sector financial soundness is shrinking. There are not enough resources to make it survivable in many different contexts. This is more true in some sectors than in others, but the economic impact has been the most devastating on the short term. On the longer term, 2 important effects that I would suggest we pay attention to is, 1, changes in consumers' behavior. The cultural sectors is made of demand and supply. If the consumer's habits and style of approaching the cultural products is changing, it's better we understand how sooner than later, because of course this might have implications for the cultural sector itself. Third, last but not least, the cultural sector, I think, has to reconsider its economic nature. What I want to say is the following. governments and non-state actors have to carefully look at the fact that most of the cultural actors in the cultural sectors are too small, too weak, and too short of slack to be able to survive crises like this one. So more intervention is needed to supply the needed buffer for this sector. I would say the entire economic infrastructure of the sector has to be reconsidered. And with that comes, of course, a lot of other consequences. Now, this brings me to which countries have been most and least affected. I mean, the situation is bad everywhere. I mean, I live in a country, Italy, in which only 1 week ago, the cultural sector went in a big square in Rome, protesting against the government because they are basically at the starvation threshold. And this is a country in which, to a certain extent, the cultural sector has been helped more than in others. So life is difficult in all countries. But I would say that those countries in which a less market-oriented approach to the cultural sector was prevalent did better. So this means that countries like France, to a certain extent, well, not to a certain extent, Germany, in the south, countries like Japan did better than other countries that had more market-oriented answers to this. And I mentioned Brazil and the US as two examples, although very different because, of course, the US can count on a very strong private non-state environment.
Thank you, Pierangelo. Do we still have time, Irina? I think we run out of time, right?
Yes, we unfortunately run out of time, but if you have one more question, I think we can address one more and then continue.
Okay, so I have one very quick question, because you have mentioned, Pierangelo, the role that the independent culture sector and some small civil society organizations have been playing in some countries and have been advocating. So do you feel that the independent cultural sector have enough capacity to really face this drop in international cultural relations? You said that in some countries they were really very active and advocating, but do you think that in the future, and seeing how the situation is evolving, that the independent culture sector will have enough capacity to change the tendency of the drop in cultural connectedness? Or it's too heavy to...
Well, it's an heavy question, but and of course how to say, the exit valve of a professor is always, it's too complicated. But let me say the following. I think here we are in a sort of a race, and the race is between the resilience of the non-state cultural organization, private organization, NGOs, cultural organization on the one hand, and the virus. If vaccination does not proceed at the right pace, especially in the southern part of the world, I'm not sure this is going to last too long. So in order to be resilient, we need to be quick. And this means, as an example, and I don't want to sound too critical toward the European member states, more attention should be given not only to vaccinate our own citizens, that of course is a priority, being myself in an age that is dangerous, but we need to take care of what's happening in the South. Because if we don't address that issue, these cultural relations rejuvenation will not start anytime soon. And I don't think we have enough. I mean, I cannot give any prediction, but I don't think the culture organization are resilient enough to last for another 2 years in this situation.
Yeah, yeah.
But
Okay.
I mean, I'm not the best person to answer this question. I think in the audience, there is people that can answer this question with much greater informed capacity than myself.
Might be, but we were interested.
But I mean, I think that there is a race, and in the race, either we or the virus wins.
Yeah, very clear. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Pierangelo.
But let's conclude with some more awful.
Exactly, that's what I wanted to say. That's what I
Sana,
wanted
it's
to
your
say.
time. It's your time to raise optimistic perspectives.
But one tiny, maybe optimistic perspective, but really very concrete one in the framework of our work. As we discussed, as Pierangelo said, we are still discussing how we will go further with research within the cultural relations platform. It's obviously very important to keep on tracking the development and evolution of international cultural relations. We would like to focus on some specific topics that would really help exploring some new positive ways out to this to the crisis within the sector. So we are going to decide on this and to start working on this afternoon already. So we will keep you informed in the future, and if any study will come out, or research or mapping or whatever. Just to say that we truly believe that we need still some input and some food to be able to help some programming and some policy making in the area at the level of EU institutions and other actors. Information is needed, research is needed, figures are needed. We want to be as much concrete as possible, but still at this stage and within this context, we still feel that we lack a lot of information to be able to impact any future policy. That's my small positive note to finish with.
Thank you, Sana, and thank you, Pierangelo, so much for this presentation, for giving us this overview of how the COVID-19 impacted the sector and the cultural relations. Thank you for your time, and hope you will be able to stay with us during the event, listening other presentations. And actually, the next part is very logical continuation of what we have just been talking about, as this is about how different countries supported culture and creative industry sector, and what was efficient and what was not. And we will go deeper into details on that issue. So thank you one more time for your time.